going to be some big questions. So for everyone attending the panel, if you'd like to ask something, when the moment strikes, feel free to drop it in the Q&A function. And you can either direct a question at one of the panelists or the panel as a whole. And we will get round to them at the end. So the Q&A will open up at the end. So don't worry if your question hasn't been asked during the chat. We'll hopefully get round to it later on. If your question's already been asked, feel free to kind of upvote the question so we know more people want to know about it. And yeah, please get involved. We want it to be super interactive and chatty and a lot of fun. So with that, I will hand over to Sophia, who's our wonderful moderator this evening, to get the conversation in flow. And thanks again for being here. I'm going to disappear now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chloe. Hi, everyone. I'm Sophia Smith-Gaylor. I am a journalist. You may have seen me on screen. You may have seen me on your smartphone screen, but whatever the screen, that's where we're talking about consent today. Wherever it is that you think you've seen it talked about or not talked about enough, that's what we're going to talk about. There is a quote I always like to think of that's been attributed to Oscar Wilde when it comes to sex. And he's said to have said, everything in life is about sex except sex. Sex is about power. And when we talk about power imbalances in this conversation today, we're going to interrogate what that power is and where that power can be found. And it's probably in some quite obvious places, but it's also in less obvious places too. So I'm really hoping we're going to have a very rich discussion today and learn lots of things. It's an absolutely fantastic panel, all from different walks of life. I'm going to give you a little intro to everyone before we get started. So we have Hanna Flint. She's a British-Tunisian critic, writer and broadcaster focused on film of culture, bylines everywhere, Empire, Elle.com, BBC Culture, Stylist, BFI. I think if there's a film, she's seen it. She's also the co-chair of the Time's Up UK Critics Working Group and a member of the London Critics Circle and an arts emergency mentor. We've also got Rukiat, an award-winning sex educator, writer and speaker, uses her platform and voice to redefine the future of sex education. She's been featured in and spoken on multiple platforms such as Cosmopolitan, BBC Sounds and Elite Daily. We have Rachel Thompson, who has a book that is just 3 weeks old, about what we've about lots of the topics we're going to be talking about tonight. So hopefully we'll get to hear about lots of those things. Rachel is a journalist specialising in reporting on sex, relationships and gender, and is the senior culture reporter at Mashable. And finally, we have Prishita Maheshwari-Aplin. They are a writer, educator, and LGBTQ+ community organiser, politics editor at Bricks, and a trustee with Voices for London. So a little Zoom clap to intro everyone. As we go, please feel free to chat amongst yourselves in the chat. If you think someone's made a great point, if you want to add something, but obviously an hour into this, we're then going to have a Q&A. So you'll be able to, we'll be able to address your question for sure when we get to that. I want to begin this by going to the film critic, Hanna. Let's all start to think of a couple of examples about where we think we have seen power imbalances, of many kinds in cinema and the media. And also think about whether they were discussed at the time or not as issues around consent to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Well, oh my God, there's so many. And I think before we kind of got onto the live, I've mentioned a few different areas in which you could fall into different categories. I mean, one of the things that I think is quite prevalent is the kind of ravishing kind of pretty much rape, like forced coercion. I mean, if you go back to Gone with the Wind, the way kind of Rhett kind of takes on Scarlett, takes up the staircases, and it's actually that she's been forced into this kind of marital rape basically, but then she wakes up the next morning kind of loving life, as if that didn't happen. It kind of normalizes it. I mean, Harrison Ford has been responsible for a lot of these representations in Blade Runner. There's a scene where like his Deckard tells Rachel that she's a replicant. Spoiler, I'm sorry, it came out in the 80s, but that's what happened. So, and then suddenly pushes her against a wall and forces to have sex, even though she kind of protests. That kind of very brutal kind of situation. And then in Blade Runner 2049, it suggested they were in love. Han Solo and Leia, she's always like, get off me, but he kisses her anyway, on the waterfront. Goldfinger. So there's that kind of element where it's that no means yes situation, which is very prevalent, and probably I would say it's probably one of the most common things that we've probably seen in film. But there's, God, I'll open it up to everyone else. I could list so many, but I feel I'll go back to you, Sophia.
Sure, let's open it up to the floor. Are there any other big major films, or even albums or songs or anything like that you think really didn't cover consent all that well?
Well, for me, I wouldn't say it was major, but it's like, because I've been watching like Korean TV series since I was like 16 years old, and like all of them had the candy girl trope. That's what they call the candy girl. So basically she's like a poor kind of girl from like really working class background who meets like a CEO of like a big company, and he's really toxic, he's got a lot of issues, and this person who clearly needs to work on himself ends up falling for the woman. And a lot of the times it's always to do with coercion. Like there's this really popular one called Secret Garden. Even the main character of that drama, like she was supposed to be strong, different, right? But even in this storyline, it was like the rich man went through a process of just kind of like breaking her down until the end. The end was just, he basically broke her down until she gave in, and they ended up getting married. But like watching that as like a young person, you don't really understand how problematic it is. And how a lot of the things that were happening in these kind of storylines where the guy is fervently chasing the woman, is actually just coercion. So that's my example.
I had to think about some of the kind of...
Yeah, I think that whole case is... Oh, sorry.
No, sorry. You go, honestly.
Sorry, I think we started talking exactly the same time. You go on, I'll go after you.
I was just having to think about like some of the more current kind of examples, because I did grow up like watching Dawson's Creek, which I think has a lot of really problematic stuff in general. Just first of all, the way that they think about virginity as this kind of like, the way that Dawson is so obsessed with the idea of his girlfriend, being almost sullied because she's had sex before, and and he's just can't move past that. But there's this storyline of Pacey where, I don't know if people remember, but basically he gets romantically and sexually involved with his teacher, and it's positioned as this huge, great like moment for him as a male, and it's like there's a lot of really like weird masculinity stuff that's tied up in it, and like Dawson's like congratulating him on like this conquest of like basically like sleeping with his teacher, when actually it's really problematic from the fact that he's, I think, a minor, and she's obviously a teacher. But yeah, like thinking more kind of like currently, I had to think about, I don't know if you remember the girls in season 2. There's I've just had a little thing that says my internet connection is unstable, so sorry if I'm like cutting out or anything. But in Girls season 2, there's a scene where Adam, he's got a new girlfriend, and he's going out with someone called Natalia, and there's this really like horrific scene where it's, I feel like it's sexual assault what happens, but a lot of people have also interpreted it as a kind of grey area, and she's essentially it's that kind of what Hannah was talking about a minute ago, which is that kind of like that romanticization of the no meaning yes, and like the fact that Natalia is like protesting, she doesn't want to be on all fours basically, and she doesn't want to be you know, doing the things that he is asking, and she doesn't consent, and it's just this really horrendous moment. And then so I think it was like that episode was quite good in that respect, because it explored the kind of like the grey area conversation. But then the very next episode, you have Adam being presented as this kind of like romantic hero. And I think that it's that kind of like romanticization. You're like, hang on, this person's an abuser, right? Like, he's just sexually assaulted someone. And on the one hand, you're like, okay, like that's like that scene and the inclusion of that moment was helpful in the fact that it, you know, shows, you know, it's not a stranger rape trope. It's broadening our understanding of like the kind of nebulous areas that sometimes these assaults take place in, which I think is really beneficial in, you know, deconstructing those tropes. But then on the other hand, you've got the romanticization of someone who's just assaulted someone and who's portrayed as this, you know, complete hero who eventually saves the day. And I just think that there's so many examples of that. The romanticization of essentially an abuser. You know, in Game of Thrones season 1, you know, you've got Daenerys and Khal Drogo, and, you know, their wedding night basically starts out with her crying, and she's really like, she's resisting having her clothes taken off. She's a teenager, he's much older, and then eventually this turns into this love story that
she's also coerced into that.
Yeah,
by her brother, who basically says, if you don't marry Drogo, I'm going to get all of him and his brothers to rape you. Like, right. That's what Daenerys' brother said. So it's like, she basically, rape is used to force her into it, and then she's got that. And it's, I mean, Game of Thrones is just literally leaden with rape plot devices. It's awful.
Yeah. So it's just like, how have we got to this point where it's not just normalized, right? It's actually romanticized, right? And I think that this is really damaging, where you end up with this kind of idea of when you if you're experiencing resistance in a sexual encounter and someone is saying, no, I don't want this, then are we being told, like, via these on-screen tropes, like, actually they are saying yes, but they just haven't realized it yet? Do you know what I mean? Like, I think that's the problematic kind of, you know, especially when we've got such limited sex education. You're like, oh, so like she wants it then, right? Even though she's saying no. And I think if you're not necessarily involved in kind of like some of the, I don't know, maybe if you're not reading books about kind of consent and not in kind of involved in that in that kind of environment, then I think it's really damaging, and it can just really hurt your understanding of how consent works, right?
Prishita, what about you?
Yeah, I was just gonna it kind of ties into that, really, saying the sort of conversation around no meaning yes and the kind of chase. I think tying links between it being explicitly you know, sort of almost rape, that does stem also from people being presented, like the chase being presented as like romantic as well. So, you know, basically there are so many, like basically all the classic rom-coms have this sort of storyline where the woman usually, you know, isn't that interested, and the man chases her and like sort of turns up at her work or like harasses her, basically, and it's coercion into going out on a date with him. But that's like romanticized, as shown as like, oh wow, it's so romantic that he's making so much of an effort to just show up at her house in the middle of the night, and all of these things, even though she's said that she's not interested. I was watching, like, I rewatched The Notebook recently because I wanted to have a cry, because sometimes you just need that healthy cry, and even in that there's, and you know, and that's the sort of upheld as this really like romantic film by a lot of people. I mean, probably not like in the film critic world, but you know, in the kind of general,
I held it up in my little circle.
I think it is, and but even in that, when they first meet, she says no, and he sort of like climbs up on the Ferris wheel and says he's not going to get down unless she says yes to a date, and that's coercion, and that sets the scene, sort of sets the foundation for a kind of like unhealthy understanding of consent, and like enthusiastic consent, right? Like not just saying yes because you basically are worried that someone's going to fall to their death from a Ferris wheel if you don't say yes. Like, that's not consent. And another thing that I've been thinking about around this conversation is sort of different types of power imbalances. Like we've talked about sort of privilege, financial privilege and gender and things. But I also think the sort of like, I was talking to my friend about this earlier, like the kind of manic pixie dream girl trope, which is so common in a lot of films. That is also a clear kind of power imbalance, because most of that trope is built on the idea that the girl usually has mental health like difficulties or has mental illness, and they're often presented as sort of like off with the fairies or whatever, and kind of needing like guidance or kind of almost saving the guy but also being saved in the process, and sort of like relying on this man and all of that. So I think those situations I think are also creating this sort of very unhealthy understanding of what a relationship looks like and what consent in that dynamic looks like.
Mm-hmm.
I recently rewatched Twilight, and I think I watched Twilight 1, 2 and 4 because the third one just bores me. So and
wait, is this reading or watch the films? I feel like you did not complete
the films.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine. I just feel like you complete the set. That's so weird for me. I'm a bit OCD on complete sets.
Not me. If something's not necessary, it's a sacrifice. And when I did a tweet earlier saying I was chairing this panel, does anyone have any things that come to mind in terms of whether they don't think consent has sort of been portrayed particularly well in film or anything? And someone said, like every scene in Twilight, and it did make me think, even before they've begun their relationship, how Edward will just magically appear in her room and watch her sleep. And obviously that is portrayed as being incredibly romantic and not at all creepy. Why isn't it creepy? Is it because he's super hot? Is it because we already know that they're gonna manifest a relationship together?
It's that fine, and it's similar to go on. Sorry, you go first.
I was gonna say, literally, Edward and Jacob are like two sides of the same coin, even though I am team Jacob. But like I just feel like Jacob was the same, but he was just more aggressive with his approach towards Bella, whereas I don't think anyone really clocked that Edward was quite creepy as well, because he was doing it in less quite like aggressive ways, like the way that he was I don't know, that's just the vibe that I got, because Jacob was like super like hyper masculine, and I feel like
he was entitled, I think.
Yeah, he behaved really, really entitled to her. But I feel like a lot of people always call him out, but I don't really see people call out Edward, when Edward was pretty much kind of like the same, I think.
There's another power dynamic there, is the fact that she's human and he's this immortal who's super strong and basically wants to control every single aspect of her life because for her good. I mean, how many times have you heard about these things in domestic violence where it's like, I do it because I love you, like I just want to protect you, and it's like, this is really problematic. I mean, what Prishita said, it's like, this is a stalkerish behavior is another kind of trope of this, where it's like, it kind of plays into this idea, this romanticized idea that women want to feel, desired and needed, and like, I just want to be, I just want someone to just be so passionately in love with me that, I can kind of ignore the red flags of this person is literally in my room watching me sleep. And that's weird. That's like super odd. And, stalkerish behavior, we've seen it in other things, there's Something About Mary, which is a perfect example where Cameron Diaz is Mary, and Ben Stiller he's like this high school. He wants to find Mary from high school, hires a private detective to find her, but then the private detective falls in love with her. And then like they end up it's just like this super weird behavior. Say Anything is the John Cusack, famously, I've got the stereos hanging outside. It's like, bro, leave her alone. She doesn't want to be with you anymore. Like it's a very weird, like, accepting thing. But I would say one thing that's kind of done it well, maybe, is like You, because that's on Netflix right now, the one with Dan Humphries from Gossip Girl, I've forgotten his name.
And Badgley.
There we go. I mean, we should talk about Gossip Girl as someone like, as I think you were saying earlier, Rachel, about like how they have there's something about, like Adam, he does this terrible thing, but he's still a hero. We often give like redemption storylines to here. It's like Chuck Bass literally raped someone in Pritchard, and suddenly he's developed into this hero who you want to end up with Blair Waldorf, even though he's terrible, he's an awful person. Like, but people still love him because like Chuck Bass. And also, you know, fuck Ed Westwick out my brain, like I haven't mentioned it, but like that's kind of normalized. Even when you hear that, anyway, I don't want to get, like I said at the beginning, and I don't want to get done for life.
Talking about Gossip Girl, though, I do feel like the new season has dealt with the kind of power dynamic coercion quite well. There is a teacher-student like relationship, and it is like slightly romanticized to start with, but like it does come out. I mean, sorry, spoilers if you haven't seen the new season of Gossip Girl. I'm sorry, I'm going to talk about it. That like it does come out later on that, you know, this teacher has like a pattern of sleeping with students, and he does get confronted about it, and you know, he does get called out for it. I mean, and like it doesn't go as far as for his sort of, you know, his job to be in jeopardy or him to actually be accountable for it. But I think if anything, that's just kind of unfortunately a realistic portrayal of how that situation will probably go. But at least it doesn't romanticize it. It doesn't present him as cute and sexy.
Yeah, because he chooses, again, no spoilers, but he doesn't choose to be with that, because there isn't a consent there. You can't have consent there because that's power imbalance. Yeah. And it's similar to what you say. And also I think another example of where it's kind of romanticized is Orange is the New Black. You know, the character who has a relationship with the prison guard, you know, that's supposed to be, oh, they're so love. It's like, but they can't give you consent because they're the guard and you're a prisoner. Like, there is no consent there. So it's actually just full on non-consensual sex. Like, it's kind of rape. Like, prisoners can't consent to sex in that situation, but that's seen as a kind of like slight love story, which is again really, really odd. Another one that I would say about like kind of that redemption kind of storyline, which again, I think we look at a movie like Crash, which came out, and not the one back in the 80s about them having sexual fetishes for car crash and accidents, but the one that's a whole different thing to about. But the one that kind of won a load of Best Picture, like got loads of Oscars, and now everyone's like, that's a super problematic film, it should never have done it. But I think one of the interesting one is when there's a scene, again, Matt Dillon, God, he gets involved in all these things. There's a scene where, you know, earlier scene, there's Tandy Newton, and I think Terrence Howard is her husband, and they're in the car, and Matt Dillon is this white police officer, and obviously they're a black couple, and they pull him over for no reason, and like Tandy Way's character kind of basically is like, kind of gives the police officer lip, and then because of that he abuses his power by sexually assaulting her in that moment. He molests her while he's giving her a body search, and while her husband's watching, can't do anything because they're two black people and they're going to get hurt. But then later on in the film, she's in a car accident and he's the police officer, and like the only way she can get out is him. And suddenly it's kind of this kind of way of like, hey, but this guy's got other things going on. He's got dealing with his dad who's a shit. But it's like, wait, so the guy her abuser has to rescue her. What kind of like, what message is that sending out? And I'm really glad that nowadays we're kind of having a reappraisal of that film for like so many different situations and the racial politics and all that. But yeah, that's another way that I feel like that's not probably one of the best examples of how we should kind of approach consent, or if it's, you know, I still feel that's quite a problematic way of viewing it.
Rachel, I want to bring you in now because you've just written a book that touches not simply on consent, but kind of, I've not read your book, but I've been following you excessively and religiously on social media because I really want to read your book. But in my book, which is yet to come out, I have a chapter on the consent myth, and it was really important. The myth that I posit in the book is that people assume when we talk about consent, we are only talking about egregious sexual assault and rape. And actually there are many layers. We have used the term coercive and coercion lots already. Could you talk us through some sort of acts essentially of sexual coercion that perhaps people don't always realize is necessarily actually impeding on their sexual consent? If you can think of any examples in film and TV, go ahead, but give us a sense of the layers of this. It's not black and white.
Yeah, so I think what's springing to mind, I've got a chapter, this is my book, by the way. It's called Rough.
Yay.
Yay. So I've got a chapter on unwanted sex, and like something that's called strategic consent, which is a term that was coined by Lena Bay Chung, who's an academic that specializes in social work. And essentially, this strategic consent basically is when someone consents to sex that they don't want to have, because that might be the safest option for them in that moment in time. And whether that's, you know, someone providing the promise of security, safety, a roof over their head for a night, and, you know, just all the various kind of like material safety that they might need in that moment. And it also kind of encompasses, you know, the fear that might come with, you know, what, you know, if I say no, they might react in a certain way. Therefore, the safest option for me right now is to just go along with this. And so, you know, it's quite grim, but basically this strategic consent, it takes into account kind of the power imbalances that are operating within our sexual culture. Because as we kind of chatted briefly earlier about, I think basically sex is a reflection of society, and it's, you know, all of the politics that exists outside in society in non-sexual scenarios, they're not exempt from our bedroom and the, you know, the sex that we have. We don't just like temporarily kind of shrug off our misogyny or racism, you know, when you enter a bedroom. So I think that sex is really political, and all of the systems of oppression that exist in, you know, in society at large, they also exist and they do manifest in our sexual culture. And so, you know, there are ways basically that, you know, inequality manifest, and that is in this unwanted sex. And so unwanted sex, just to clarify, that is there's two versions, which is like non-coercive and then there's coercive unwanted sex. So non-coercive unwanted sex, that's basically when they consent to sex that they don't want to have, but they aren't being coerced. They're like, okay, well, I don't really feel like it. And that can be in the context of a relationship. But there's also instances where you feel, because of certain, you know, gender dynamics or various reasons, you might feel like, okay, well, they paid for dinner, so I owe them sex. Or, you know, this person's much more powerful than me and I should just go along with this. So there's all kinds of reasons why, you know, maybe to do with privilege as well, you know, and that person holding more privilege, and, you know, and so basically there's all kinds of reasons that feed into this dynamic of, yeah, okay, you've consented, but why, right? And I think that all too often when we think about consent, we see it as this yes-no binary. And once we've sort of, you know, ascertained like, okay, well, that person said yes, and that's like, well, okay, we've got no more questions to ask because we're satisfied with that answer. But I think that we should be questioning, you know, like, okay, well, they said yes, but why? You know, what were the reasons that, you know, fed into that? And so, you know, there's in this chapter that I mentioned, there's things to do with like our attachment style. So, you know, basically our own psychology. So if you're an anxiously attached person, you're more likely to consent to sex that you don't want to have because you want a person to, you know, like you. And I'm an anxiously attached person, and I see myself in that dynamic because I'm, you know, very often I'm like, okay, well, I want this person to like me and I want to feel close to them. So I'm just going to, even though I don't really, you know, do that. And so, but there's all kinds of different reasons, yeah, that, you know, as kind of socioeconomic and, you know, just gender roles as well. There's also, you know, so men and ideas surrounding masculinity, you know, the myth that kind of men are always wanting sex, men are always sexually available, men are horny, and all of this stuff, that also influences men to feel pressured into consenting to sex. So anyway, I feel like I've gone off on a big tangent there, but yeah, so that's kind of some of the more, you know, what you could say is like a gray area, you know, where you're just kind of, you might come away from a sexual experience thinking like, okay, well, I didn't really love that, you know, and why did I do that? And, you know, it's that kind of like more nebulous sort of experience that I do think within a broader, context, or where inequality exists, in our society, I think there are dynamics that are problematized, and that we should kind of look at, because there are obviously like lots of different reasons why human beings have sex. Like there's, I think, 237 expressed reasons why human beings consent to sex. But like some of those are totally, they're
Oh
not.
my God, are they listed somewhere? I want to read them.
Literally, they're in an academic paper. I think it's by the Kinsey Institute.
Oh my
And
God, link me.
Literally, well, it's in the book. So yeah, and there's like all kinds of reasons that are like, not just being horny and wanting to shag, but like also just wanting to like show their partner that they're loved, and yeah, just like all kinds of reasons that I can't remember right now.
Wouldn't it be incredible if we were taught the phrase strategic consent at school? Because I certainly wasn't. And another phrase that I only learned after watching I May Destroy You, and the press coverage that came out of it, was the idea of conditional consent, i.e. if somebody consents to sex, it's almost always with conditions in place. And obviously this, if you haven't seen it, it's incredible, please watch it. But the scene in I May Destroy You, she consents to sex, but it's sex with a condom, and during sex he takes the condom off, and then pretends, doesn't he, that it kind of like fell off or something when he actually took it off. And this has come to be named stealthing. I don't actually know if it was named stealthing before or after. I don't know how long it's been a thing. Very interestingly, this is something I want to raise just to see what you all think. When I was looking at stealthing for my book, I spoke to a lawyer friend, and she said, have you seen all these campaigns happening now after I May Destroy You, trying to get stealthing made illegal, like actually included in sort of legal clauses? And I was like, yeah, it's great, isn't it? And she was like, kinda. Don't you think stealthing was illegal anyway? Don't you think it was rape anyway? Rape is illegal.
I mean, look at Knocked Up. Like, I feel like that is a perfect example of a film which totally normalized the fact that she said, hurry up. And he just thought, oh, I thought you said, throw it away. She did not say those words. And then she's pregnant. And then they end up together. And it's like, it's just bullshit. I'd be furious if I got pregnant because someone basically did not put their condom on. And then it suddenly turned into a movie where it's like, hey, we're going to have some ups and downs, but let's stay together for the kid. So that just reminded me of it so much. But that's so wild that, like, you're right, it is illegal. But I suppose there's not the specific. It's supposed to. Is it because we don't have? It's so vague that we have to be. I mean, it's like the kind of you can't consent to your own death, like the choking situation. Yeah. It feels like surely men shouldn't be able to use that as a defense, but they do and get away with it, or had done.
Yeah, I think its inclusion as a clause is something to do with the fact that an attempt to make it more visible as a crime, which I can understand the feeling behind that. But I mean, when my friend said that, I did think, oh my God, goodness, yeah. Is it because maybe I'm not a lawyer, but yeah.
I think it's been, because I remember speaking about like stealthing like in 2018. This was before it came out, but there was some, I think in the UK it was considered to be sexual assault, but I think maybe I May Destroy You made people even more aware about it. But I think it is actually in the UK, like there is I'm not too sure, but that's what I read back then, but I'm not 100% on that.
No, it's basically conditional consent. It now exists. Basically, it happened, a sex worker, basically her condition of consenting to sex was that the guy wear a condom, and he refused, and so there was a conviction, and so now, because obviously the law operates on precedents, then they now like have that as an example that's going to kind of lead, I think, basically pave the way for like future convictions. But the problem, I think, with stealthing, and it absolutely, like, conditional consent is what this is, and it does exist. It is rape in English and Welsh law, and I'm thinking Scottish law as well. But like in places like America, I don't think it exists in legal language, and so the term stealth, and I think that's the problem, basically.
And it also reminds me of this, wound me up so much at the time. but it was a rap song that became a viral TikTok sound. And in the rap, he says,
Body.
do you see the state of her body? If I be it, I ain't wearing a Johnny.
Yeah.
And at the time, funny story this, but at the time I made a TikTok about a research paper that had found it had they only surveyed quite a small number of men. So it's a small study. However, points to the need for further research needed, because it found that men were less likely to want to wear a condom if they considered their partner to be particularly attractive. And equally, they were more likely to wear a condom if they thought their partner wasn't particularly attractive.
Is that like a primate? Is that like a weird mating thing, where it's like, I want to have progeny with someone that I think is more attractive? Like
that was one of the that was one of the hypotheses that they presented. I think there were
that just kind of make it sound like that just kind of excuse the behavior as like, oh, it's just like biological and evolutionarily, which even if there's a kind of an inclination from a biological sense, that doesn't obviously doesn't excuse it.
And it was in contrast, they actually thought, when they were asked, do you think more attractive people are more likely to have STDs? They said yes. So even though they actually believed logically that these people, because of their attraction and therefore sort of presumed bonus sexual activity, I don't know, they still engaged in risky behavior. And I listened to that song, which was promoted as a sound, and teenagers were lip syncing it up and down the country. Actually, when I first made it, the TikTok got taken down. Oh, like mood lighting.
I love that when you said it's like taken down. It's like, okay, it's got you there live.
That was cool. That was so cool.
TikTok police found you.
Oh my god.
That for me kind of ties in, because I've been speaking a lot about this on my Instagram. It kind of ties in with like lookism, like the whole thing about people not respecting people who they don't find necessarily attractive. It's interesting how even though those attractive people were quote unquote risky, they still, risked quote unquote risked their health for those attractive people. And I don't know, it very much reminds me of like people just not having respect for people who they don't find attractive and stuff like that. But yeah,
it's clearly that there's so many different like aspects. Like you said earlier, like how there's over 200 reasons why people have sex. I think there's like, I don't think there's one reason why men just decide to basically abuse that power or refuse that consent. I think there's so many different reasons why they would do that. I mean, God, and the most excuse I've got is like, oh, I can't, it itches, or it doesn't fit, it's too small.
It doesn't fit. Oh my God.
Get out of it, mate. It ain't that big.
That's the worst one. And then the thing is also when what I notice as well is that when guys stealth, because I've been stealth before, when they actually do the stealth and they come up with this, it's like they just come up with like such a really silly excuse. Like I know that in what was it? Sorry, that show that you were just talking about.
We may not destroy you.
Yeah, how I may not destroy you. Like how he just said, how he just kind of like mumbled under his breath like his excuse. And even when it happened to me, it was just kind of like, I thought you wanted to do anal. I was like, what has that even got to do with you taking off the condom? I don't understand. But anyways, that's one thing that I notice about guys as well, is that they come up with the most, even when they try and lie, it's such a really ridiculous excuse.
And it's also about themselves totally. Like the act of like intercourse is supposed to be like an equal, like you're supposed to be two partners in it. And it's always the place where it's always a man's, or like the person's like their pleasure takes precedence. You just said like, why are you taking the condom off? It's like, oh, the dudes could still have STIs. Like it's just, You can't get pregnant. It's like everyone forgets. Like people think, don't worry, I'm on the pill. Like said, oh, don't worry, I'm on pills. But it's like, no, but there are other things.
Exactly. That's also happened to me. That's also happened to me before. Like where like a guy was like, oh, are you on the pill? And I was like, no. And then he brought out the condom. I was thinking, are you not thinking about STIs? Like it's not just about getting pregnant. But yeah.
Fun fact, as you've brought Anna up, but we are only in the last 5 to 10 years starting to see research from the scientific community that examines sexual behaviour. There is now a paper that has come out that has shown, it had British data in it, it has shown how normalised it is in heterosexual relationships for men to try and coerce their girlfriends into having anal sex. Yeah, there is now a study to back that up. If anyone wants to read it, I can try and find it somewhere.
Yes, please, could you send it? And that also, could you, this is supposed to be private, but could you send that and the small study as well with those men?
Yeah, seriously, this my book is all about taking these studies out of scientific literature and putting them somewhere where they are like accessible and like consumable. But yes, I will send you the study separately anyway. But yeah,
I
think so much of that behavior as well though stems from just like a lack of, we talked a little bit about how, well, you said earlier, Sophia, like, you know, how you weren't taught in school what these terms were. I mean, sex education in the UK is like terrible. It's not at all broad enough, and it's not inclusive enough. But I think part of the problem is also that, you know, sex is presented as this thing that's like done to girls, to women. Their virginity, which is not even a real thing, is like taken from them. And you know, female pleasure or pleasure for people with female bodies is not prioritized. It's sort of all about the male ejaculation being the thing that's centered and prioritized. And so, of course, with sex education being like that and not talking explicitly about different types of consent, or like even what healthy relationships look like. I mean, I personally think that sex ed should also include conversations around like how to communicate boundaries and needs and respect other people's boundaries and needs. You know, but that's like so far away from anything that's talked about at the moment. It does set up this sort of foundation for people to grow up and sort of cis men in heterosexual relationships to think that sex is centering their pleasure, and if it feels better to not wear a condom, then that's what matters ultimately. And they can, you know, coercion is fine because it's all about them. Like it's a thing, that sex is a thing that they're doing to a girl, not with her.
Yeah, and cinema is like a massive culprit for basically centering male pleasure. I mean, how many times have you seen sex situations where like they just go straight at it? There's no warming up for the girl. They're going in straight, they're going in raw. And then also the sex ends when the man has climaxed. You know, that's about it. One of the things I think is really interesting is this, you know, how you have like the Bechdel test, what someone did, this thing called the clit test. And it's really good to show how, whether like female identifying sexual pleasure is shown. There's so many good ways, like I've seen, or even just like normalizing some stuff. I think there was this movie came out last year called St. Francis, and you know, that had period sex in it, and it was really good because it saw the consent. One of the best things I saw growing up, you know, you talk about what we saw growing up, but I think one of the best movies to show, because I think it's also good to show where there are good examples, but like there's a film, Love and Basketball, which is like one of my favorite movies.
Oh, I love Love and Basketball.
As a former basketball player, I love it. Like, just makes me watch a basketball movie. It's one of the few ones that are available when I was younger. But like, you know, what I love about this film is directorial debut. There's a sex scene between like O and the main cat Monica, and you know, talking about condoms. You see them spend time. He's like, is this okay? He takes time to put the condom on. It's awkward. It's giggled. That is what it's like. You know, it's really, and I think, you know, that came out 20 years ago. So there have been little bits, but we just, you know, it becomes, and that's the difference here maybe, is that we've got a female writer and director in charge of it. And I think hopefully what we're seeing now is that because we're getting more diversity of voices, people behind the scenes, we're getting intimacy coordinators, we're getting, you know, a lot of people kind of having more people in the writer's room who are able to say, whoa, you should probably not do that. Or, you know, I think you should add this in, or maybe like, instead of having this close up here, why don't you show that? You know, other things. I mean, Annette, I'm sorry, this great musical that came out recently, they have a musical number while he's like, Adam Driver's giving head to Marianne Cotillard. It's like, that's what we need to see. So sorry, I got very excited about Annette giving it a head scene. It was great.
Speaking of intimacy coordinators, you reminded me of I interviewed Ita O'Brien, who I don't know if you have heard Michaela Cole's speech, but she dedicated, I think it was her BAFTA to Ita O'Brien. She was the intimacy coordinator on I May Destroy You and on Normal People, Sex Education, loads of shows that are on TV at the moment. And she was basically saying that, because I asked her kind of like, you know, what is the future of the sex scene on our TV screens? Like, what do we need to move towards? And basically, she wants to work towards, first of all, much more consent negotiation, but also just like much more realistic, like those like awkward moments of like you're fumbling with a condom, or you can't get like the bra off, or something embarrassing happens, like those awkward moments that literally that defines like real life intimacy. Like sometimes you literally can't explain why you're laughing and it's awkward, and that's just how it is. And I think that kind of like realism, it makes it so much more believable, and you almost see yourself in it. And there's actually research done on this that was like, basically people are, if the sex scene is more realistic and is like, you know, feels more intimate, people are much more likely to kind of internalize the sexual scripts, so the cultural ideas that it's essentially disseminating. And so once you have much more believable sex scenes, you know, that's an educational moment for the viewer. And that's why I think these writers, directors have a responsibility, actually. If they're going to make it more realistic, then it's really important, obviously, to include consent negotiation, and perhaps like a moment where like protection is being used, or, you know, there's boundaries being discussed. And I think also just like, I think what we were talking about earlier, and kind of like how sex education needs to change. I also think like as individuals, we should be trying to model kind of ethical sexual behavior where, you know, it's not just, I was speaking to this sex educator recently who was basically saying that in conversations with teenagers, he sometimes gets questions like, is it legal if I do this? But really we should reframe that as like, is it right? Is it moral? And like, are we being like the best version of ourselves? And are we caring about that other human being in that moment? Even if like, you're never going to see them again and you don't like them, you don't love them, but like you owe, like, I feel like what we owe
respect,
each other,
isn't it?
Yeah, it's respect. And it's the basic decency of just caring about other people, right?
But what you've just said there, even when just at the end there, you're basically pointing to, even if you only see someone for one night, you know, it by no means diminishes the amount of mutual respect you should give to each other. If you are delivering sex education that is ultimately sex negative, and you're simply obsessed with just trying to stop these teenagers having sex, you're not giving them the ethical education to approach these scenarios when they're ready, which, you know, doesn't need to be literally gong 12 at midnight, they turn 16, woo, I'm ready for sex. Like, no, that's not how it works. But it's like, you're not properly preparing them. I do want to throw a fly into the ointment, because we've raised two things tonight, which I really did want to raise. One is the clip test, which Hannah brought up. It's really fantastic. I suggest going on their website, because it gives you a list of films that have either, or TV programs that have either passed or failed. And it's really funny reading why they've passed or failed. But also Normal People was really, really hailed. There were loads of press coverage on why it's really good. There was consent negotiation. Do you think Normal People passed the clip test?
No.
It failed. So this television program that was lauded across the media for how it portrayed sex actually failed, perhaps, to portray sex in another kind of way. And it's interesting how we like clutch onto things, and we're like, we're so happy that at least this one thing has been covered, that we'll then bang on about it, and actually we don't necessarily interrogate it and look further and think of, did it meet everything?
Because I don't know, I was going to say, because straight women especially, I think, have very low standards when it comes to sex and intimacy, and accept anything, like even if it's just like I don't know if it was what the sex was in that show? Was it just
She-
heterosexual sex, or was it different kinds?
She kind of, I think for an experience, she suddenly liked a specific, like to be dominated and just basically prioritize being manhandled. And I think there's a
So it
nice
was
bit
with
at the
men.
end where the good guy, Colin, and he's like, they're having it in his like childhood bedroom. I think everyone likes that little moment. Is it? I can't remember. It's so long ago, but I don't remember the sex in that as much as I remember in I May Destroy You, which I think is the greatest thing that we've had in ages because of the broad spectrum of it, not just one type of kind of.
Because it even reminds me of like I don't know if anyone has seen Power, but Power is like known for like the really glamourized, the really glamorous sex scenes. But one thing I used to, when I was always watching these sex scenes, I used to think to myself like, but why is there never a condom? Like we never see any condom. Why is it that everyone's just so ready to just have sex? Like no matter what the situation, the woman is just ready to off her knickers. Like what about if she isn't there any time where she's like on her period or anything like that? Or why do we never even see like the knickers, like especially after a long day? Sometimes I think to myself, why don't we ever see their knickers? Why are their knickers always so
clean?
Lovely clean lingerie, stuff like that. It's just
a good version where they make a joke about that is in this movie called Obvious Child, which I adore.
I was just about to say this.
I love that, and I also think that's a really good handling of kind of sex. And also I feel like we've kind of skipped on this a little bit, but because of like drunken sex, like how can you give consent when you're drunk? I think one of the worst culprits for it is 16 Candles, where I mean, at the end, you've got Jake who's like, Jake, the high school jock everyone loves. And he basically ditches his drunk girlfriend for Andy. I don't know if his name's Andy, and I think that's pretty big. Anyway, Molly Ringwald, it's her birthday. And then he basically says to these like nerds saying, oh yeah, my girlfriend's drunk, why don't you go have her? And then the joke is that they both, like a nerd and this girl, wake up and like, oh, we don't remember what happens. But she was so fucked, she clearly could not like consent to that. So yeah, like things like that all the time, like just terrible.
I earlier this evening I tweeted and Instagrammed, oh, you know, anything come to mind that was a bit sus? I've had a lot of people bring up Bridgerton and coercive reproductive sex and that, which I do think people simultaneously talked about that a lot of the time, but also could not stop watching it. And it's like, you know, it's bad, but you keep watching it. And it's literally used, someone during this conversation used the term plot device. It is used. Consent and the lack of consent is used as a plot device. Someone's also gone, every Disney film.
Yeah. I mean, Snow White, she doesn't give consent. Sleeping Beauty.
But also every Disney film has a huge power imbalance anyway at the heart of it. Like, you know,
it's
a helpless princess who needs rescuing by a strong prince.
Girl trope.
And so then because he saved her, he gets to kiss her as well and like marry her, basically, is the intuition is what they're saying in the Disney films. But yeah.
It's interesting getting into the nuances of it though, because I think with the Bridgertons one, that's a really tricky thing. And I think it's similar to the way Wonder Woman 1984, one of the big criticisms of that as one of the plot devices is that how does she bring Steve Trevor back? Well, actually, he's taken the body of someone else and she sees, because his mind has taken over. So actually they're using this body and then they have sex. So, but the guy's body is basically been used. It's similar in one thing I hate about, I mean, a lot of things I hate about Harry Potter, but like the one thing in the Fantastic Beasts one is kind of the storyline for, I think it's, I can't remember, it's one of Leta Lestrange's mother, is that she was under the Imperious curse, put under by her biological father, because he wanted to have power over her mother. She was under the Imperious curse, has no consent, couldn't control anything. He was telling her what to do. They had a kid together. So basically she's the product of rape as well. Like, so these little things that we just kind of throw away, like use it as like, oh, this is kind of a fun thing to like do. We don't think of the wider ramifications. Like Passengers, the Chris Pratt and Jennifer Lawrence movie where he's woken up on this like massive long space journey to the end, and it turns out actually he woke her up on purpose because he didn't want to be alone. They're all in sleep panels, so he's basically killed her because it takes another 1,000 years to get to where they would go. But he was this lonely man who was like, oh, I'm lonely, I got woken up, so I'm going to wake up another woman who I think's hot, and I'm going to basically light her on this journey and then say all this, and suddenly at the end it's like, oh well, I mean, that's the strategic thing. So what else is she supposed to do? She's supposed to kill herself, or she's supposed to live the rest of her natural life, you know, with this man. And it's like, I think we're getting nowadays, is because we're improving, we're also finding ways that actually we've got, our standards are now being raised higher, that things like the Bridgerton things, now we're having these conversations. And it's not, I think that I love that we have these discussions about it, because then we can only move on and grow, rather than say, let's totally trash Bridgerton because of that one thing. Maybe that was an error in judgment, but we can learn what we're going to do next and how we're going to make it better.
And I think
the Bridgerton one is interesting. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say briefly, I think the Bridgerton one is interesting as well, because the majority of these dynamics that we've discussed with examples of coercion, it's like a man kind of coercing a woman in a heterosexual relationship. And I think the Bridgerton example is interesting, and it's not great the way it was portrayed, but it is good that they portrayed the kind of woman like coercing the man, because that doesn't get talked about enough. And because men are also presented as well, or like stereotyped as always wanting to have sex and all of that, male survivors don't get the sort of the respect or the kind of belief or like the representation as much as female survivors. Well, I mean that's a very little, bar is very low, but
yeah, but it's good to have that
like,
representation.
It's kind of like men are sort of like patted on the back for it almost. So it's kind of very important for it to have been represented, to have an example shown where it does happen the other way around.
And also men on men. I think Outlander did one where I think the main guy, Jamie, he got raped by Captain Randall. And I think, again, like you said, it might be a smaller amount, but again, it's like everything's so one. We've got the factory settings of like cis, really, actually mostly white as well, let's be honest. But like it becomes this thing where actually, hopefully now as we move on, like I think there's also an interesting dynamic with Bridgerton, is that he's a black man and she's a white woman, and that kind of like the kind of racial context there is also kind of a bit murky.
It is now 8 o'clock, which means it's time to bring in the wonderful questions people have been asking. And I'm going to begin with a whopper of a question that someone's asked, which is, do you think these movies encourage young people to feel almost grateful for attention, which is ultimately predatory? I think that's a really compelling question, because it is the idea that if we can begin perhaps with the age power dynamic that we were talking about, but the idea that it might feel good to be wanted by like an older man, for a young woman, for example. Do we think these movies actually influence people who are watching them?
Yeah, I do.
Definitely.
Back to what I was saying about like with Korean like TV series, like for example, there was one that I watched this year that was the girl had 2 guys chasing her, but one was very much, I want you, blah blah, can't you see my undying love for you? And then there was another one that was kind of like, I'm going to be patient and I'm going to do things according to what she wants. Like I like her, I'm going to let her know that I like her, but I'm not going to throw myself onto her. And he ended up getting the girl in the end, and I saw so many fans complain, so many young girls complain that he was the one who ended up winning in the end. And I was like, wow, like young girls are becoming so conditioned to just think that because the other guy is like so expressing his passionate undying love for her, that he must be the one that is meant to be with the woman. It's the same thing with like How I Met Your Mother. Like I preferred Robin with Barney, and a lot of people preferred her with Ted, but I was like, Ted came on a bit too strong, and a lot of the times the stuff that he did was a bit creepy, but because he's portrayed as like the nice guy.
Oh my god,
he
don't get me
gets
started
away
on nice
with it.
guys.
Classic.
We'll need another
Like,
hour.
Ted was like the textbook, like quote unquote nice guy, but actually a lot of his behavior was very toxic. But I don't want to get into that. But yeah,
I think also, you know, society does make money off our low self-esteem, and so to kind of like, young girls are already being taught to seek validation from external sources, and if media portrays that validation as like romantic validation or sexual validation coming in that kind of format where there is a power imbalance or there is coercion, then of course at a young age you're going to be drawn towards that, and kind of seeking validation from those sources externally, especially as young teenage girls whose self-esteem is being leached on.
I also think we have to factor in, when you watch films, most of the people are really hot, like, and people can't separate that. I remember when you came out, and I think Penn Badgley actually had to tweet like, "You're not supposed to fancy Joe. You're not supposed to like this guy. Like, if you fancy him, that's on you." And so one thing I really liked about Promising Young Woman is the fact that Emerald Fennell cast as all her bad guys, like the super nice guys from TV. She cast like Seth Cohen and what's his name, Max Greenfield from New Girl. Like, she specifically cast these kind of nice faces, friendly, gorgeous faces, and like, you know, people that you just don't think are that bad. And actually said, no, these are the guys, are the predators. And I think that, I will hope that nowadays we kind of remind yourself that actually sometimes it's a nice guy, sometimes it's hot. Not everyone's going to look like Harvey Weinstein, basically. Who's going to be like, you can't, and in this way cinemas works, we can't have every character is not going to be, you know, looking like that when they're a predator. And I think that's right. Life as well. It's like predators come in every single form, but we kind of like the predatory behavior of really hot guys because we like the way they look. It's like, oh yeah, we have the fantasy. It's like, oh, I mean, girls I know, I'm having a conversation with girls saying, I really love the rape fantasy. And I'm like, but who is the one who's the kind of the rapist? Like, tell me what he looks like, because he's not looking like, you know what I mean? You're not imagining Weinstein there. You're imagining this absolutely hot guy come in and ravage you. And I think in a way we need to reconfigure and rewire our understanding of like, it's so, you know, the cognitive dissonance, I think, a bit of it.
Yeah, I feel like looks really, like, if you're conventionally attractive, like, people put more trust in you, or they excuse you for doing a lot of fucked up shit. Like, there was this girl who she stabbed her boyfriend because she was like super jealous, but because she was attractive, she actually has fans. Even though she's in prison right now, she has fans, because a lot of people just saw it as like, oh, you know, she's just a really passionate girlfriend. But I thought to myself, if she wasn't attractive, I don't know if you guys would be fans of her. So yeah.
I mean, I've heard people be like, oh, Ted Bundy was so cute.
I
hate that.
Charles Manson.
I mean,
it's gross.
It's one of the reasons he wasn't caught for so long, because you know, he was seen as an attractive young man.
And then you get Zac Efron playing him in the movie. Anyways. It's like, oh great, have like super hunk Zac Efron playing a serial killer. Great, thank you for that, Hollywood.
Well, it is a psychological phenomenon. It's called the halo effect, and it's basically like good-looking people, you ascribe all these characteristics towards them, and like you see it in real life. You see, like, I mean, I've had like people I've worked with who are like just really good looking but like really incompetent, and everyone's like they're amazing at their job, and it's like they're not really fit, that's all. But and that's why we see all these, you know, people who are just really conventionally attractive, and it like is just completely infiltrating our ideas of like, you know, what is acceptable behavior in a
it was interesting. Someone in the comments has said, can we talk about the film 13? And I think that's also like how young, and it reminds me also of like Almost Famous, and how there's this like young music journalist, which is one, it romanticized groupies. And I think a lot of those are different ages, but there's a scene where he's like, I think he's like 15 or something. They're like, come and like have sex. He's like, no, it's like, come. And it's like, it's implied that I think they've had sex. And then he kisses Penny Lane, Kate Hudson, and when she's on Quaaludes, like, oh, she won't remember. And I think also you're talking about the age situation as well, like Lolita, like that's a really weird film, and like how the power dynamics are at play. But how are we presenting? Are we normalizing sex between minors in a way that seems like romantic? Should we have more responsibility there as filmmakers? I don't know. There's another one that came out this year. Oh God, I can't remember the name, but Suzanne Linden film, and it's about she plays a 16-year-old girl who ends up having a relationship with a 35-year-old actor, but that's kind of based on her own experience. It's very French. I can't remember the name of it, but it's like super French, and that's like I felt kind of uncomfortable now, but if this came out 20 years ago, would I feel that way?
I can remember when An Education came out. I thought that was really good it knew it was portraying an uncomfortable relationship, it was, I think it did a really good job of making you feel uneasy as the audience. And I think if a story depicts a relationship like that makes you feel uneasy, it's probably done a good job. Someone's asked a really good question that I want to ask now to make sure that we give it the time that it's due, because we haven't really covered it yet, and it's really, really important. As we learn more about consent, lots of people are realizing things that have happened to them previously were not fully consensual. What do you think about this retrospective understanding of past experiences, and how can we better support people who come to these realizations? Something that I'll just chime in on is the next few years in public health in the UK, if public health bodies listen to social scientists, is going to look so much better on this front, because social scientists have already pitched a new way of measuring sexual health in the UK, and it goes way beyond sexual health. It goes way beyond bugs and babies, i.e. teenage pregnancy rates and STD rates, and it will start to better measure sexual justice, sexual equity, and sexual well-being. And when they measure sexual well-being, they ask questions that will help us get a sense of this kind of resilience and retrospective look at your sexual biography that whoever wrote this has kind of intimated that. But really interestingly, they'll be asking us questions like, in the past week, did you feel bad about a previous sexual experience? Wow. If you say yes to that, you've not been able to access the sort of soft skill of resilience about sex. And it may be that you weren't given the right education, or it may be that you weren't given the right support after trauma, for example. They also ask questions like, is there someone you can speak to openly about your sex life in your personal life? Because whenever social scientists try to measure resilience in anything, they almost always ask us, is there someone we can talk to in our lives about it openly? And obviously, if you don't have someone that you can talk to about it and you keep it all inside yourself, you're not going to be able to feel good about, you're not going to be able to talk through these experiences as well. So what do you think about perhaps how cinema, music, and the issues that they raise are making us retrospectively look at our sexual biographies?
I was going to just tap into also this. I think this question taps into something that's called unacknowledged rape and unacknowledged assault. And so this is something that came up a lot when I was doing interviews for the book. And so many people would tell me something, and they would be like, I consider this a grey area. And then they'd go on to explain something that, absolutely had all the hallmarks of a rape or assault. And I think when I started to delve deeper into this topic, what I realized is actually it's incredibly prevalent. Something like they've done like quite a lot of studies on it, and it's something between like 30% and 88% of rapes just go completely unacknowledged. And there's so many reasons why, that the fact that we live in a victim blaming culture and all of this sort of stuff, but it's really, really normal. Basically, it's really common to for it to take years, sometimes decades, to accept that something that happened wasn't consensual or it was assault. And I think it's just a very personal process that a lot of people, it takes a bit of time basically to understand these things. So that's, I just wanted to chime in with that. But I think it's just, it's really complicated basically. Sorry if my connection's unstable.
Oh no, don't worry. I really, really hear want to hear from the sex educators, especially on this. Is there anything that you can educate us on about revisiting, and what happens if we're watching something? Say if you're watching I May Destroy and you're like, oh my God, that happened to me. Like, how do we cope?
I think it's more of like a mental well-being kind of thing, because that happened to me. That basically explains like my whole experience in terms of sexual assault and rape and stuff like that. And a part of me coming to terms with it is just accepting that, okay, it's happened. In my case anyways, I knew I couldn't get any justice for what had happened, but the fact that I was more informed, it was just about how I'm going to approach sex in the future. And if I ever am in that situation again, now I feel more empowered because I know how to help myself. And this happened to me when I'd spoken about being stealthed. This was actually in 2019, and it was December 2019. And I felt like absolute shit, because I'm thinking, I'm a sex educator. Why is this still happening to me? That's the kind of thing that goes on in your mind. But I realized that no matter how much knowledge you have, no matter how much you know about these things, when it comes to being assaulted, when it comes to rape, it's about somebody violating your boundaries, and there's nothing you can do about it. But what kind of still empowered me, or what made me feel like I could still advocate for myself, was what I did afterwards. I knew about, okay, how to access my local haven, what to do if I did want to press charges or like build up a case and stuff like that. I knew all of those things. And even though I felt terrible, and also the fact that I could access free counseling as well. So even though the situation was really, really terrible, the fact that I knew what to do afterwards was so important. So that's the best advice that I could give to people, especially if you know that the previous situations, it's not really something that you can go back and get some sort of justice for. It's just empower yourself, so you, in the future, you know what to do, and you know how to identify those kind of situations.
We have a great question about normal people. And I didn't read the original book, so I didn't even know about this. One thing that bothered me about the colorblind casting of normal people, in the book, the abusive Swedish boyfriend is white, and in the series, he's black. I don't feel like enough thought was given to the implications of existing racist tropes, i.e. black men brutalizing white women for their relationships. What does the panel think? Any thoughts?
Definitely. I think that's I've maybe I need to watch this, because I had no idea about that. I find that interesting how they change the race of the person. That's the thing, when people who aren't POC or black work behind the scenes on these kind of films, they miss those kind of blind spots. I don't think it's necessarily that they did it on purpose. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But I think a lot of the times, if you don't understand those kind of connotations, you're not going to understand how it's going to look like on screen. So even with like Bridgerton, for example, I don't think they there was a lot of connotations that I didn't really like. Like, for example, a lot of the black characters, the black female characters, were kind of, in the background, they were kind of like props, whereas they weren't really necessarily involved, but it still looks like diversity. Or like the quote unquote black female characters weren't black, they were mixed race. Or like the way how the black men were kind of portrayed, like the Duke's dad was like this really horrible dad, and that just kind of like feeds into the stereotype of black men even further. His best friend, who was also black, was like this boxer. Also in Sex Education, the two black characters, they were best friends. I don't know if you guys remember the black guy, he was like really popular, and then the black girl. She was dark skinned. She was plus size. I don't know if you guys remember.
Yeah.
I mean, I love how everyone was saying that, how it's great that we saw like a really platonic kind of friendship going on between them. But I was actually like, if you guys really think about it, those kind of girls, like the fact that she was dark skinned, she was plus size, yeah, those kind of girls are never portrayed as the romantic interest. So actually, I wanted to see them have a romance between themselves. But when the people behind the scenes don't understand that, that's where you get those kind of blind spots. So yeah, it's important that, I guess, the people behind the scenes are Black POC, so they get these kind of things.
There's also a really good Galdem article that was basically saying, with regard to like normal people, that Marianne basically, she goes through like a string of like basically non-white boyfriends, and she almost just like, it creates this trope on screen of like, she, you know, regards like people of color as like just the experimental boyfriends that she does not end up with. And I haven't read it for a while because I think I read it last year, but it's definitely well worth a read, just because it it kind of just feeds into that like disposability, the kind of like the characters that are people of color like are just these disposable like plot devices that are in the background, and it's just these are the people that Marianne dates until she finds like her one true love, so
and this is the thing, I think when the people are writing these stories, I think they feel like it's like really diverse and oh my gosh, it's so progressive, but they just sometimes they don't understand that the way how it looks like on screen, it really does portray quite negative connotations. So yeah.
Next question. When we talk about representation of consent and power imbalances, it's 99.9% heterosexual relationships. How do you think this impacts queer relationships in real life?
I mean, massively. Sorry, I just like jumped in, but
go ahead.
Like hugely. I think we've kind of touched on this already, but sexual coercion and sexual assault and rape are massive issues in the gay male community, especially because men do come into the relationships with this expectation of being taught that men just want sex and they'll just be up for anything, and then they'll just always wanting sex and horny, and it puts a lot of young gay boys who are trying to like explore their sexuality in a really, really vulnerable position, and at a lot of risk, and then it continues on. I mean, it's very, very normalized because the way that these dynamics are portrayed in the media, or the way that we talk about them for the most part, it isn't in a heterosexual context, and so it's kind of very normalized amongst gay men because it's not like questioned as much or like raised as much, or there isn't as much representation of it. There's not as much conversations around it, which can be really harmful, and well, it is really harmful, and hurts a lot of people. And I think also the sort of bringing in of compulsory heterosexuality and sort of like there is a lot of trying to replicate heterosexual relationship dynamics in queer communities as well. I think we fall into a trap of kind of putting ourselves into binaries of like tops and bottoms and all of that within queer relationships as well. So those power dynamics can totally be replicated if that's what people have learned from the world around them, and it's not been challenged through the right sort of education or through the right sort of conversations. It very much is and can be and is replicated even within queer relationships, because of those like power dynamics that are the binaries that are imposed on people.
When you speak to sex educators, one of their biggest criticisms of sex education curriculums is always there's not enough in there about power and gender. You're spending too much time on harm and minimization, and you're assuming that the harm to be minimized is teenage pregnancy, STD transmission, and increasingly there is a lot of chat about consent and avoiding being raped or assault. And it's like, protect everyone against these three things and then they'll be fine. what we've been discussing is obviously not be fine. You need a lot more education. And obviously tackling power and gender demands also addressing LGBT relationships. And it's not only about addressing power and gender within heterosexual scenarios, it's also about going through the entire LGBT plus spectrum.
Yeah, I mean, there's also power imbalances between cis people and trans and non-binary people as well. You know, like even in those kind of sexual scenarios, there are a lot of trans women who are vulnerable and who are extremely marginalized, and sex is one of the ways in which they can sort of look after themselves, but that is very much used as like a power technique by a lot of men who are like, you know, ashamed to be seeing trans women or sleeping with trans women, and sort of that is almost, well, that is, you know, a sort of a type of coercion as well. It's like, you know, knowing that as a cis person, especially as a cis man, you have that kind of power over giving validation and safety to a trans woman who is just very marginalized in our society, but you're like abusing that power in order to like have the relationship look the way you want it to look without giving them the choice, really. And that is an abuse of that power dynamic as well, and that's not talked about at all, really.
There's one question. We have 5 minutes left, and I think this is a nice question to dwell on for the end. If there, hang on, where? There are so many questions. Which one was it? Yes. If you could change one thing about how we are taught to understand and view media portrayals of sex, consent, relationships, what would you change? That's a great question. That's basically about like literacy, like media literacy almost. But yeah, what would be the one thing that you'd like to change?
I would just like people to be students, young people to be provided with the tools to be able to be critical of everything that they consume. I think just even being told that you should be critical of the media that you're consuming, that you should be questioning what it is that you're learning from it, because it's like we're taught in schools to, you know, in history we were taught, you know, don't trust the sources, like be critical of who the source was written by, but we don't get taught in sex education or any other education to kind of question who has written the media that we're consuming, and to be critical of what it is that is being taught to us. So I think, like, apart from all the things that we've talked about, actually just even being told to be critical of it and what to like look out for in being critical of it, and like the writer's biases, etc., is important in itself.
Right. Yeah. It's about teaching them to kind of like differentiate fiction from like real life, and not to like internalize everything that you see. And I think it's on the part of the people who are making these films and whatnot to really change their approach, and to, especially when the sex scenes thing, like what we've spoken about before, that's one example of like the way how sex scenes are like portrayed on TV needs to change. So yeah, it needs to be both ways, I think.
And I think it also would be like, if we're thinking about how, like, what needs to change, like, I think that, you know, who we get to see having sex on our screens, you know, like, it's really rare that we see like disabled people, for instance, having sex scenes that are positive and that aren't just there as a kind of shock factor. And again, like fat people, and we want to, you know, see the kind of mixed coupling, not just a fat person with another fat person, you know, like I think it would be really cool in sex education, like when you said that really good looking one, the one that's a swimmer, I can't remember his name, but they would have been a great couple, and I think that would have been something that really pushed the narrative forward.
Exactly.
Yeah, so I think if the only people that we are seeing on our screens are like conventionally attractive people who don't have disabilities, like is that and you know, typically straight couples as well, that, you know, if those are the only sexual scenarios that we're seeing, like is that is that really a positive thing? I don't think so. I don't think it's representative of everyone's sexual experiences. And I think also just the tropes, like the really harmful tropes that keep getting regurgitated and disseminated, those are like, we internalize those and they shape our cultural understanding of other humans, other communities that aren't, that don't necessarily, share our lived experiences. And I think that that's something that directors and writers need to be really mindful of as well.
I just think, I don't know, it's been, I'm 33, so it's been a long time since I've had sex education. It was pretty much a power, like what are they called? Overhead projector, laminate slip, and about that's about it. I just think we need to spend more time, dedicate more time, and I don't know, like I don't know if they do like PSE class, instead of that being like a random mix up and you do one session on sex education, it should be part of the curriculum, a module that we continue doing, because I just don't think you can sum up the kind of complexities and nuances that is sex and consent and society, because it's all about, again, sex is part of like a way of control on women or people and marginalized people. And I just think we need to spend more time on it. So actually do a proper, 3 months, but make it a proper part of it, so that, and continue it, not just you do it in year 9. It's this, we kind of keep continually top it up and update and learn from it, and don't try to normalize things, because there's no such thing as normal, is there? Because it's all subjective.
I also think the basic media literacy skill, which will take you through everything through life, which is what you see on your laptop screen, your cinema screen, your TV screen, your phone screen, A, is possibly not real, and B, nor does it pretend to be educational. Everything from something like Normal People to soap operas, even to pornography, none of it pretends to educate us. It pretends to entertain us. And in many cases, what it does intend on doing is entertaining us and offering some kind of escapism or some kind of fantasy, whatever it is. It doesn't pretend to be realistic. And if you better set young people up.
I do think it does try to say that it's trying to say something. There's a lot of people, their intent, like I think film is about saying something about the world, and it's whether that they aptly get that across through whatever methods of filmmaking that they do. So I don't think it's just, I think to say that's not education within cinema or film, it's not really there.
It's not that it can't be. It's not that it can't be educational. But I mean, I doubt the filmmaker. The filmmaker doesn't necessarily think that, oh yeah, this is going to end up in someone's like English lit class, and they're gonna like learn about. Well, some of them do. Some of them do. Like, sorry to like name drop, but like I interviewed Ridley Scott once about the terror, and he says like, people stop reading books. People aren't reading history books anymore. Where do you go to learn about what happened years ago? You look to TV and film, because we digest it. The medium's change. So in a way, I think, of course, not all directors and filmmakers' sole purpose is to like teach people about it. But I think a lot of them, look at Moonlight, a perfect example of showing you like what love can be between two black men. Like I think Barry Jenkins for sure was trying to say like, I want to educate you on a different side that you're not seeing on screen. So like, I get there's some that aren't going to cut the mustard, but I do think it's all trying to say something. It's just whether the filmmakers are taking responsibility for the words that they put, the kind of message that they're putting out there. Is it responsible? Is it respectful? But again, sorry. On that note, I'll leave it to Chloe.
Hello. Thank you all so much. This panel was great, and I've definitely learned a lot. There's loads to go home, and I am home. Sorry, the nature of the pandemic. There's loads for me to go and think about, and I'm thanks everyone who's joined for all your amazing comments and questions. It's really great to see people interacting and getting involved. And thanks so much to the panel. We were so excited that everybody who's here today was able to make it. Thank you, Hanna. Thank you, Prishita, Rukiat, Rachel, and of course to Sophia for moderating the panel. It's been really, really great and a really wonderful way to celebrate Sexual Health Week. we're going to be trying to host more of these events. This was kind of a new thing for SH24, but we've loved it. So there will be more in the pipeline, so keep an eye out. And yeah, thanks again for joining us. We're really grateful you came to be with us today. And it always feels very impersonal ending the Zoom, but again, nature of the beast. So bye everyone, and yeah, see you all on our socials.